Alrighty, so in this lecture, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into my personal recommendations of how you should begin to prepare for the MCAT. Now, this by no means is a replacement for any kind of standardized recommendations from a pre-health committee or a third-party resource like the Princeton Review or the Kaplan or any other kind of resource. But more so just my anecdotal experience of kind of preparing for the MCAT and how I think things should be broken down. So in the last video, we introduced like the MCAT scoring system. So this is just my blog post, the MCAT, and here's the link to get to that. And I'll pull this off to the side so you'll have access to scanning the QR code unblocked there. But it kind of just addresses some more of the features we've covered here, but again, in more formal text. So I recommend you take a look at that as well. The price here too kind of waxes and wanes. So, at the time when I wrote it, it was $320. Now it's, a little bit more. So just keep that in mind. So how, I guess, you should kind of approach the MCAT. So obviously the first step is really learning the content on the exam. We've kind of covered the basics, the basic 4 sections and what you need to be aware of, but you still need to learn the material then in each subsequent section. Some people like to approach it by learning, one total section and all the material associated with it at one time and then switching to a different section. Other people, depending on your study style, can learn all 4 sections simultaneously, and by switching back and forth, it kind of gives them a break or a reprieve from, kind of drowning in all of the biology or all of the chemistry at one particular time. So you got to find out what's going to be the best option for you and kind of go forward with that. And this is a learning process. You're not going to have the perfect schedule as you go through because everyone's such a unique and different learner. So it's kind of a lot of trial and error to get to the point that you're actually comfortable and you're moving things down the field. So again, learning the content. A lot of that comes from the resources I've mentioned before, a lot of the free content, but I think some of the best material that you should consider is the textbooks. And so the textbooks are produced by Princeton Review, Kaplan, or there's other third-party resources out there. Those are the 2 primary big ones, and they tend to have the best content. But again, I haven't utilized other resources, so I can't say that they're not good. But those basically, that's kind of the bare minimum for how you get all of the content knowledge. The reason why I liked doing the self-paced course, it was because that it gave me the textbooks that I used and read and then rewrote the notes and typed up stuff for it as a way to kind of like internalize the material instead of just reading the text. And then there were also subsequent follow-up videos on the online platform, so I would do a whole bunch of toggling between reading the text for the chapter, writing out all the information, and then going and watching the video to reinforce the concept a few days later, and then adding to my notes that I previously thought were like completely filled out and obviously needed a little more adjusting and more kind of reinforcement of the material. So, if you don't want to do one of those courses along those lines, I still recommend you get some books. Usually the material doesn't change too much, so you can always get an older edition of the books. Usually you can find someone who's like doing hand-me-downs, or you can find them online for relatively cheap, especially when people are trying to unload the books and get rid of them after they've obviously taken the exam. So you can always get like a few years older, like the edition and stuff like that. But that's what I would recommend for content review. The next thing there is, I think there's a lot of hype about like identifying the style of questions, as I was talking about previously. And some people, swear by this strategy. I myself, I was kind of more on a time crunch where I needed to make sure I got all the material internalized prior to then having time to then analyze question styles. I found the method to be somewhat counterintuitive. Like I felt like I was focusing too much on trying to identify the question style rather than just answering the question itself. Perhaps I wasn't utilizing the strategy appropriately, or, I don't think I was as disciplined as I needed to be to actually make that a successful strategy. But that is something that you can learn and then employ that in your actual test-taking skills. But it was a little more esoteric for me. It was a little abstract, I should say, in the sense that I just struggled more with I didn't need to learn this is a quick response question, or this is a different type of a question style. Like this is an extractor question or something like that. I'm not sure if that's actually a question type. I just made that up, but they have different names and qualities that help you like identify them. And I felt that was a little bit too much for my particular level at the time. Another thing I want to endorse, though, is that speed is absolutely critical. As a slow reader like myself, it's really, really challenging because you're fighting not only against the rest of the students taking the test, but you're fighting against the clock too. One of my problems that I struggled with a lot was coming across a question that I knew I had in the back of my head. I knew I understood the concept, but I couldn't, quite put my finger on it. I couldn't quite extract the information that I needed. So I would sit there and I would kind of get bogged down on a question. For a question that should have been, a minute and 30 seconds worth of time. I've read it, and then I sat there and I was just kind of stumped over it for a while. And that would happen quite a bit. And it's frustrating because the material is there, but you just can't visualize it or kind of pull or extract that information to fit the needs of the particular question that's being asked. So, long story short, essentially just you got to be fast. You got to know when you need to give up and kind of just surrender that question and move on. That was very difficult for me personally because in pharmacy school, I felt like a lot of the material you were able to kind of sit there and kind of mull it over a little bit, and you could really, really think about it for a long period of time, and then you could figure out the question because speed was never an issue on pharmacy exams. I felt like I was given a lot more ample time versus on the MCAT, I was kind of pressed to the wall with all the free response, or I guess with all the large prompts that you were expected to read, and then pull information from those to answer questions. So I thought that was definitely a challenge of the MCAT, and I can imagine you will as well. I also want to introduce a concept called voiding your MCAT. And this is basically granted to students where they can sit for the exam formally, and at the end you are given the option to actually void the exam in the sense that you will not have your score graded. Now, why would anyone ever do this? You might ask, but some students might just have a really bad test section and they are 100% convinced that they totally bombed the exam, or a student who has a migraine halfway through the exam. They kind of give you the I guess the courtesy of having the option of not having your score graded. So that is something that you could definitely consider if you're having like a mental breakdown or something along those lines during the exam, and for a fact that you kind of didn't perform to the level that you were hoping. There's no way to objectively tell if that's the case, but that can be something that you can employ to kind of give yourself some time to kind of recoup things. Some students will even just take the exam just to kind of simulate the environment and then void it just because they wanted to see what the experience was like. I don't necessarily recommend you do that. I think it's a waste of money, but that is an option as well. So kind of breaking down the template that I usually recommend for the exam itself. Now, this is a very loose template. You don't have to use it, but I think it's a good way to kind of structure things out and to make sure that you're staying on top of your schedule. Now, if you're taking this between your P2 and your P3 year during that summer, you have a little more flexibility with how things work versus if you're taking it in the middle of a pharmacy semester like I did. It was very, very challenging, and keeping to the schedule was an absolute necessity because it was very easy to fall behind while simultaneously having to study for pharmacy exams, while trying to schedule in my practice exams, which are very time-consuming practice exams. It takes a full day. Roughly you can obviously read the text here, but about 4 to 5 months out, this is when you consider really sitting down and saying, I'm going to take the MCAT. I think, I generally recommend you have that much time unless you are pretty confident in the material that or you have basically free reign, full amount of time to really prepare for the exam. You can easily take the exam in 3 months or less, but I generally recommend 4 to 5 for people who are a little more removed, like pharmacy students removed from the material. So obviously content review in the manner in which we kind of discussed already, and registering for the MCAT. Initially during that 4 to 5 month out, you could also consider taking a practice MCAT exam. And that would just refer to any of the free resources I recommended. I recommend you avoid staying away from the AAMC free one at that time, just because it is AAMC content. Remember, that's gold. So we like to reserve that for, closer to the actual test date because it's supposed to be most representative. So, taking one of the third-party practice exams just to get a feel for, get a baseline, figure out where you sit. My first MCAT I took, I took it just to see how I did, and I actually did better. I got like a 501 on this practice exam, and I did better on that first initial practice exam before even studying a second of material than I did on my actual first MCAT. So, maybe I just had beginner's luck, but I don't know, or I just regressed throughout that time period. But I think it's good to, I guess, get an appreciation for how challenging the test is, but also to kind of get a good baseline to see how far you need to go. So as you can see, 3 months out, I continue to review, continue to learn. At that point, I usually say like about a month per section. That's how much time I kind of allotted myself to basically learn all the material in a particular section. Now, granted, the cars section doesn't necessarily need an entire month by itself because you're not learning content, you're just practicing. So cars section is more so just utilized, and you just practice passages throughout like every single day. You should do at least 1 to 2 cars passages just to make sure like you're kind of building that mental muscle and like figuring out and getting used to the style of questions that they ask. So, you review and continue to learn the material, finish, one section within a month. If you start at 4 months, be done with the biology section by, 3 months out, and so on. So then obviously practice questions and exams. So 2 months out, develop a plan to finish all the content within the final month. So you should have no more content review, no more new content to do if you were a month out from the exam. That's like the ultimate goal, because this final month out, you'll see, is just a full review, multiple full-length tests, and a lot of people will switch into the full AAMC content. This is where you enter like an exclusive period of time where you are only doing AAMC content because, like we said, it is most representative of the MCAT itself. So, backing up to 2 months out, you should definitely be taking full lengths at this time, and full lengths are just, full length practice exams. They have half like exams that you can consider taking, but I don't think they're as good because, it's good if you're in a time crunch for like you have other things and plans for the day, but a full length is most representative of like what you're going to experience on test day. So I recommend that. As you can see, 1 week out, the last two, basically you take your last 2 AAMC exams during this past week and then doing section banks. So I ended up taking, 2 exams. I think I took one on the Sunday. I took my exam on a Friday, so I took it, the last exam on that, for one of these AAMC exams on the Sunday, and then I took another one on Tuesday, and then I gave myself, time to review the exams. Reviewing the exams is very important, so I recommend, some people say it's even more important than actually just taking the exam itself. So make sure you review your questions and understand why you got things wrong. That's really important. And it's also important to note that you don't just review the incorrect questions that you didn't get correct, but do the ones that you did get correct, because you need to make sure you got them right for the right reasons. And that should be pretty intuitive as well. In the final week out too, the psychology terms, like I mentioned already, the psych-soc section is a lot of mental regurgitation, so it's just kind of refreshing with some of these terms that you might have kind of lost touch with over the past couple months as you're scrambling to get ready for the exam. So just brushing up on those terms so that they're fresh in your head. Most of the other content you can't really cram for, so this is pretty much the only section you can cram for. And there's a good Quizlet I typically recommend finding that you can just rip through, 800 questions or 800, psych-soc terms right before the MCAT. I ended up doing the 800 questions literally the day before. So I know I say please do nothing, but I ended up doing a couple hundred of the psych ones just because I didn't actually get through all of them the day prior. But generally speaking, do nothing, go out to dinner, treat yourself low stress, because you've worked so hard over these 4 or 5 months to get to this point that you don't want to burn out. You want to have a good night's rest and you're ready and well recharged. So as you can see, this is kind of, is another just a chart that you can look at to see how you can employ some of the resources we talked about. So you'll see, take your first full-length exam, like we mentioned, begin learning content, and then register for the MCAT. So kind of different things that you should be doing as you progress through. So I'll leave this up to you to read through. I just want to draw your attention to the point that I made earlier with the third-party resources down here. You kind of draw that line where you shouldn't be doing any further review at this point, and you just switch to AAMC content exclusively at that point in time. So, the MCAT section is a little bit lighter in the sense that, like I said, I kind of defer a lot of information to third-party resources just because I'm not a professional, I'm not an expert when it comes to the MCAT. I think the degree of how challenging this test is, I think it needs to be almost referred out to someone who does this for full-time consulting and whatnot. So I defer that out, like I've said. So again, the MCAT is not a clinical exam, and it tests applicants on a large volume of undergraduate level content. So it's a lot of volume, a lot of principles, and then a lot of extrapolation. So you can't rely on pharmacy knowledge, which is unfortunate. I didn't realize that was the case when I first was taking the exam, hence my poor score. Again, we've stressed this point already. I told you guys I skimped out the first time around. Don't skimp out on preparation material. This exam is really, really important. And saving a few $100 on the front end here is going to be inconsequential to how much money you'll make as an attending down the road. So, if you delay a year because you can't get into medical school because of a bad MCAT score, well, you theoretically lost $500,000 salary as a, orthopedic surgeon, like one of the examples we talked about previously. So, it might seem like a lot of money up front now, but in the grand scheme of things, it's really nothing. So, like I said, AAMC content is gold. Develop a study plan and stick to it, and some of these third-party resources will kind of help guide you through that process. Generally speaking, like I said, one topic, you should basically cover one topic in a month or less, and then move to the next topic, or you could do it all simultaneously at one time. Push your exam back if you're falling behind, or your practice full-length scores aren't at your particular goal. Your AAMC goal practice tests that I mentioned in the final week that you're going to be taking, those are going to be the most representative of the kind of score that you're going to get. So, for me, I was fortunate enough where I was getting like 506, 507, and I was uptrending, which is usually a good sign for applicants in that final week. And so I was actually expecting like a 506 to 508, maybe even a little bit higher, 509. And I was very happy to see that I had received a 510 on the exam. So, some people will swear by the fact that they kind of, on test day, you perform to the maximum level. So you'll have like a slightly higher score than some of your test grades. I wouldn't rely on that. It can happen. It happened for me, but I don't think it's like necessarily there's not like a science to it. And then last but not least, don't void your MCAT unless you like absolutely have to. And, this is when you really predict that you think you just did terrible. I think a lot of people, unless you definitively know, like you didn't finish like 15 questions in a section or something like that, you probably are overestimating how terrible it was. That's not to say that you're going to know yourself the best out of anyone, but voiding, I generally recommend you don't void just because you're going to have to sign up for the MCAT again at some point, so you're just kind of delaying the inevitable. And that kind of concludes the Chapter 3, the MCAT.